Live from America's heartland, this is the Daily Truth Report with your host, Noah Christopher.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. We have a very special guest with us tonight for the very first time, someone who's never been on the show, but I've been a big fan of his work for a long time. We've got an award-winning filmmaker, writer, journalist. For over 40 years, he's been in the business. He's worked for almost and had his work displayed on almost every major network out there. He's even a seasoned actor on stage and on the screen, appearing in over 500 productions, but most known for his work regarding the moon landings and whether or not those were real. Spoiler alert, I think you're going to find out in just a little bit. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Bart Sibrel to the show. Welcome, Bart.
Thank you, Noah. How's it going?
Yeah, very good. Well, I have been looking forward to this for a long time, and especially ever since we set it up. But like I said, I have watched your movies and followed your work for a long time, and it's just absolutely fascinating to me. So we're going to talk about the moon landings and whether or not they occurred. There's so many places we could start, Bart, but I'll just say right off the bat, you've got a website. It's right on the screen there, Sibrel.com, Sibrel. There is a ton of material on that website. We'll reference it throughout the night. There's clips there. We might play a couple of those clips, but so much information there. And, you know, Bart, you've got so much that you've pieced together on this. For those who don't know you, I'm wondering if you can give us the 2 or 3 minute version of your history. Growing up, did you believe in the moon landings? Your life's work has kind of become this, but what was Bart like as a kid? I mean, are you looking up at space and looking at the sky and wondering what's out there? Give us the quick story on that.
Well, my father was in the Air Force, and in 1969, I was 4 years old, and I was asleep in bed. However, my father, being an officer, got a VIP package of color prints from Apollo 11, and he gave them to me as a cherished present, and I put them up on my bedroom wall, literally as kind of a shrine. So I thought they were great. You could almost say I worshipped the moon landings. And being in the Air Force, we moved every couple of years, and wherever we went, there was that section in my bedroom wall of these 15 or so pictures of the Apollo 11 alleged moon landing. And then when I was 14 years old, I was watching a television program, and the guest was a gentleman who worked for NASA during the Apollo program. And he said they didn't go, they couldn't go, and that they bluffed like a good poker player. And of course, I'm 14 years old, still had an open mind. And I thought, never thought about that. So I went back to my bedroom wall, and there they were. 10 years, I'd seen these every day, 3,650 times, assuming that they were on the moon. But it was kind of like my eyes were wide shut when you look at them critically, especially the original prints before they were color corrected, where the soil is caramel brown and the background is grayish blue. You can see where the real dirt ends and where the fake backdrop begins. So that kind of planted a seed in my mind. If you go 10 years forward from that, as a 24-year-old, I'd become a filmmaker. And of course, a filmmaker's job is to make fake scenes look real. And I can tell you with 100% confidence that the moon missions are fake. In fact, if you go to Sibrel.com, there are 4 videos on the homepage. The first is called The Moon Landing Fraud in 3 minutes. And I show a picture allegedly on the moon in sunlight where the shadows intersect at 90 degrees from objects 5 feet apart of one another. So that cannot happen in sunlight. It's just impossible, which means it's electrical light, which means they're on Earth. You could really prove that the moon landings are fake in a court of law with one photograph. Just go to Sibrel.com. It's that top left of the 4, or it's the first one on a smartphone, and it's a 3-minute video where I show this picture and I show what it should look like if it were genuinely taken with sunlight, where the shadows are parallel and never intersect. So if you have 2 shadows intersecting at 90 degrees from objects 5 feet apart, it's electrical lighting, because one object is, and so that cannot be duplicated in sunlight, which means it's electrical light, which means they're on Earth, which means the moon landings are fake. And
Bart,
not only
is this the first thing that you noticed that really tips you off that there's something strange going on here, or was it
no,
the dirt?
the first thing was the fake backdrops.
Okay.
Because mind you, you see the color of the moon there? That was the color of the soil. That's the actual color of the soil if you're on the moon. That's why the first Chinese probes show the soil as a caramel brown. And then the backdrops were grayish blue. NASA has since color corrected all the pictures so that the soil is grayish blue to match the grayish blue background. But originally the soil looked of that color, caramel brown. The backdrops are blue. You can see the distinction left to right horizontally. And, it's the amazing thing as I was looking at these pictures, 3,650 times not seeing this because I wasn't looking for it. You see, I just assumed that they were on the moon. And, when you talk about conspiracy theories, there was the former, maybe she's still director of YouTube, Susan somebody, and she goes before Congress, I think before the little scenario of the last 3 years happened, promoting censorship, saying censorship is a good thing. And the number one rallying cry she used was people who say the moon landings are fake. And lo and behold, they were fake. So if they're taking down what is the truth, then what is left up there? You see, it's a bunch of lies. And the most fascinating thing about the moon landing fraud is that it's actually true. So you can prove it with that one photograph that they, didn't go to the moon because the shadows intersect at 90 degrees when they should be parallel.
So
you can prove
just before we move on from that, Bart, just to make sure. So you're basically saying, you got, when you're up in space, there's only one light source. That's the sun, right? And so the sun is 91 million miles away or whatever it is. So if the sun's that far away, all of the shadows should be parallel because they're all coming from one distant light source. But you've got intersecting 90-degree shadows. It's got to mean two light sources. Is that what you're saying?
Well, or one light source that's very close, one of the two. The point is, that video, it shows what they should look like. We put the pictures side by side. Just go outside at noon on a cloudless day, look at two trees, two telephone poles, or two people standing 5 feet apart, and their shadows are parallel, and it's impossible for them to intersect. So if they're intersecting at 90 degrees from objects 5 feet apart, that's an electrical light that is so close. If you stand to the left of it, your shadow goes one way. If you stand to the right of it, your shadow goes a different way. And this is from the, quote, last mission to the moon. So they, it's not like they faked the first one and went later. No, they never went. And you can prove by logic because today, with 50 years better technology, the farthest that NASA can send an astronaut into outer space is 1,000th the distance to the moon. So what they're really claiming is back in 1969, when all of NASA combined had 1/1,000,000th the computing power of a cell phone, they sent astronauts 1,000 times farther than they can send them today with 50 years better technology, which means they're saying they had better technology, 1,000 times better in the past than in the future. Well, that's a historic and scientific impossibility. There's never been an instance in the entire history of the world where technology was greater in the past than in the future, which means it's a forgery. That's what it means. I mean, if they could drive cars and play golf on the moon in 1969, then we would have been on Mars 10 years later. We'd be in another solar system by now, and there'd be bases all over the moon. I mean, just 10 years after the first atomic bomb exploded, just 10 years later, atomic bombs were 1,000 times more powerful. So we should be able to go 1,000 times farther into space 50 years later, when in fact we can only go 1,000th the distance 50 years later. That's why there's mannequins orbiting the moon in the latest NASA venture. They can't even land. They can't even orbit with humans because of the radiation. Now, the book you see there called Moon Man, the true story of a filmmaker on the CIA hit list, is interactive. The top left button there, if you want to click on it, says Moon Man video links under the Sibrel.com icon. And if you click on that, that takes you to 16 video links, all of which you could see for free right now. Basically, my book, which is an audio, which I read myself, Kindle or print, is interactive. I basically write a chapter and then I say, go to clip 1. I'll write another chapter and say, look, if you want to understand what I'm about to talk about, watch clip 2. The second clip there is called A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon. These films cost $1 million and were financed by someone who builds rockets for NASA, who knows the moon missions are fake, who wished to remain anonymous so his stock wouldn't go down, you see? And then in this 7-year project, we uncover classified footage of fake photography of the crew of Apollo 11 faking being halfway to the moon with a 1-foot model, dated 2 days into the flight with a third track of audio from the CIA telling them to mimic a 4-second radio delay as if they're halfway to the moon, when in fact they're in Earth orbit. And what a surprise, 50 years later, they still cannot leave Earth orbit. So all of these things I talk about in the book are backed up through these clips. And you can see a clip, third row, second from the left, there's Kelly Smith. He says, this is an engineer at NASA today. He says that the radiation to the trip to the moon is deadly, and that the technology to go through that radiation field to the moon and back and survive, that technology to do that has yet to be invented. He says it out of his own mouth. And I'm like, oh, well, then if the technology to go to the moon and back and not die has not been invented yet, then how exactly did they go to the moon in 1969? And then a couple of clips to the right of that is the one you mentioned, where an Apollo astronaut says that NASA intentionally destroyed all the technology they used to go to the moon. That has never happened in the entire history of the world either. For example, if you were going to destroy a technology after you used it, you might be the atomic bomb, right? Like, okay, we let the genie out of the box here. Let's, end World War II and let's, destroy it so that we won't have to do this again. Maybe they could have done it but did they do that? No. They made atomic bombs 1,000 times more explosive in only 10 years of development. You see, you can't have Lindbergh fly across the Atlantic in 1927 and 54 years later, no one from any country on earth can fly an airplane over the Atlantic. That just doesn't make sense. And if it weren't for people's emotional attachment to the glorious moon landings, people would see the truth. Noah, I talked to a college professor of an aerospace university, and he said even if he saw an Apollo astronaut on national TV confessing that the moon missions were fake, he would still think he walked on the moon anyway. He refuses to recant the glorious moon landing. This is like Santa Claus for adults. So really, the most profound thing about all of this is that it's not a theory they faked it. It's an absolute fact. You have to keep in mind, we have Bobby Kennedy Jr., right? He has more access to the Kennedy assassination files than Oliver Stone does. And he says that his uncle, John F. Kennedy, was killed by the CIA. Mm-hmm. So then we have Robert McNamara, who was defense secretary during the Vietnam War. When Johnson took over, he rescinded all of Kennedy's orders to end the Vietnam War, to end the Federal Reserve. He rescinded all of those. And then they said, well, look, public support for the Vietnam War is non-existent. They don't want to get involved. We need a Pearl Harbor type of incident. So they created something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was allegedly a North Vietnamese ship attacking a United States ship. Robert McNamara, before he died, confessed it never happened. Him and the CIA made it up. Well, Congress passed a law called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution based on something that never happened, based on a myth. You see this? Mm-hmm. So that led to the death of 3 million people, including 58,220 of their own people. And then you have 9/11. You have 3,000 architects and engineers signing an affidavit, risking their livelihoods, risking their reputations, saying it's mechanically impossible for a pinhole airplane to go in and out of a steel grid and to cause its collapse. All you have to do is look at the Oklahoma City bombing picture. Half the building is blown away and the thing stood rock solid. So here we have a government who killed their own president, who started a war without cause that led to 58,220 of their own people being killed needlessly. Remember, they lost the war, so it's needless, right? And the beginning of it was completely fabricated, meaning unjustified. Then 3,000 architects say they killed 3,000 people in one day without thinking about it. So I think if they're willing to kill 3,000 people on 9/11, 58,220 during the Vietnam War, and kill their own president, I think they're willing to fake an image of the moon on television, don't you think? I don't think that's too sacred after having done all that murdering. And if you go to Sibrel.com and read my book, the second to the last chapter is called NASA's Greatest Fear. Mind you, I had a millionaire who builds rockets for NASA backing me, and we got access to some pretty severe documents, some of which I was asked not to put in my film. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon. Since then, the people involved have died, and now I put them in my book, including the testimony of relatives of dead Apollo astronauts who told me, it's not my theory, they say with 100% certainty, their husband and father, who was going to be the first man to walk on the moon, was murdered by the CIA. That's what they told me. And they have proof to back it up. And I put that in the book. So we have our government not only faking the moon landing,
And who
murdering.
Who is that, Bart?
That was Betty Grissom. She told me that on January 26, 1967, her husband, Virgil Grissom, who was going to be the first man to walk on the moon, came home from work and said, "Hun, for some strange reason, the CIA is all over the launch pad today inspecting the equipment. Why is the CIA here? Never seen them here before in all these years. Why did they show up today?" The very next day, the guy is dead from, quote, faulty equipment. What happened is a few weeks before, he held a press conference without permission and took a bunch of reporters up to the top of the moon rocket and affixed a lemon to it the size of a grapefruit and said, "This thing is a piece of junk. It's going nowhere." And he was a boat rocker. He was a whistleblower, and they got rid of him. And this is not my saying. It's the dead man's relative, his wife, who I interviewed for 4 hours, and the dead man's son, a 747 pilot, who I interviewed for 3 hours. If Bobby Kennedy Jr. says his uncle was murdered by the CIA, I believe him. And if the widow and son of an Apollo astronaut says their father and husband was murdered by the CIA, I believe him. And so, when I was asked to do this, Noah, back, I don't even remember when, 1989, I was first asked to do this movie. And I turned it down. I said, look, shadows intersecting, and 2 of the 3 astronauts won't give interviews, and the Soviets spend 100 hours in space for every 20 hours we spend. Something's not right about this. I'm not going to risk my life, for what Nixon did. Forget it. And then I changed my mind. I started reading the Bible and realizing there is right or wrong. There is a judgment to come, and I'm going to die anyway. And you have to look at it this way, Noah. This is what it dawned on me, and this is what people have to see. The faking of the moon landing is actually considerably more historically significant than if they had actually gone. Do you see that? Of the 2 possibilities, either they planted a flag, whoop-de-doo, they came back, but they can only go 1,000th as far 50 years later, or they completely contrived it. They murdered people to keep it a secret. They put it on stamps and on coins and held ticker tape parades and give these guys medals of honor for being such good liars. If that's the truth, that is so much more profound. And when you find out it is, first we have the shadows intersecting, but I still said, well, I still won't say they faked it for sure. Then we find the classified footage of them faking being halfway to the moon. And I'm like, oh, that's it. I showed it to the NBC news director, who practically fainted and said, this absolutely proves they didn't go to the moon. I said, I know. What do we do? He refused to broadcast it for fear it causes civil war. 10 years later, we have a new news director at NBC. They fly me to New York. They put me up in the Waldorf Astoria. They pay me thousands of dollars for the exclusive license of the footage I uncovered, which 2 NBC news directors agree it proved they didn't go to the moon. And right before it's to broadcast nationwide to break the story, the moon landings are fake, they get a call from the federal government and they back down. And all of this is in my book, which I've never talked about publicly before, and it's all at Sibrel.com.
Bart, there's so much in there to unpack. I've taken a ton of notes. Let me just take a couple things piece by piece, if you don't mind. I just want to follow up on a few because it's just so fascinating. You touched on the importance of this, and this is something that's fascinated me for a long time. And That's why it's so fun getting the chance to actually talk to you. But I've had friends and family ask me, what does it matter? Why do you care about this? Why do you, maybe they did, maybe they didn't. Why do you care? It's a huge deal. And not that we have any illusions that our government is telling us the truth, but this is a absolutely massive scandal. And it's like you say, you can take the evidence into court and you'd win the case hands down. So that to me, I've never understood the question of what does it matter or why do you care? To me, it's greatly important.
Well, let me answer their question. Okay, their question is actually almost relevant. I mean, it's seemingly relevant, and here's why. Let's say they faked the moon landing and didn't kill a single person. It would be like those stories you hear every now and then of the crew that tunneled from the dry cleaner underground into the bank, took all the stuff out of the vault and got away with it. Maybe it's just me, but I'm kind of secretly, proud of their cleverness, even though it's wrong, of course. But imagine they killed 3 guards who had toddler children and wives, and they were just married a few years. And the children became fatherless and the wives became widows. Do you respect them then? You see, this is why it matters. This country was founded by not the Constitution, by the Declaration of Independence. And it says that the reason this country was formed was because King George became a threat to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This was after only 5 people died in the Boston Massacre. Now, let's talk about the first one, life. We know from Betty Grissom and Scott Grissom that they murdered 3 men, to cover up the moon landing fraud. Okay, so not only is our government taking what in today's dollars is $200 billion to pretend to go to the moon, which is embezzlement, then they're using that money to pay the salaries and the hardware of CIA agents who then murdered Virgil Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. You see? And so they are a threat to life. They are not only taking our money and using it to deceive us, which is multiple crimes there, they're using our money to hire government employees to kill people, American citizens, who are exposing the corruption in the federal government. That's worse than King George ever did, right? And so why is our nation so complacent when the atrocities of the federal government against their people are so much greater than anything King George ever did? In fact, the news director was onto something. Whoever killed Kennedy, he's still dead. And whoever did 9/11, they're still dead. This is different. This is a positive lie. This is giving candy to a child during a temper tantrum known as Vietnam War protests. Finally, something to cheer and wave your flag about, right? They could guarantee its success by faking it. In fact, that was the code name, Slam Dunk, by Johnson himself. He says it's a slam dunk to go to the moon successfully because we're faking it. We got it. We filmed it a year in advance. It's a slam dunk. Now we give candy to the American public during the Vietnam War. And now, 50 years later, we want to take away the candy and give them a plate of manure instead after they've boasted for 50 years that their team won the Super Bowl. For 50 years, our home team won the Super Bowl. And you say, wait a minute, they cheated. They bribed the referee. They put drugs in the Gatorade of the opposing team and they changed the score. And you're like, no, how dare you say that? Well, the thing is, even though this killed fewer people than 9/11, right? Or even the Kennedy witness assassination list, right? It's the one that would enrage the public the most. Mind you, a news director at NBC said this proves they didn't go to the moon, the film I uncovered, which you can see for free. Sibrel.com, click on A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon on the homepage. And then he said, I cannot broadcast this, that he did not want to go down in history as the man who caused the next American Civil War. And I realized, okay, so what you're saying is if we show the public how corrupt the federal government really is, that it'll bring down the corrupt federal government. You see? And this is, I forget which historical figure said it, and I'm probably misquoting it exactly, but if you know the good you ought to do and don't do it, you're sinning, right? He said, tyranny keeps going on because people who know what's going on don't do anything about it. They think they're innocent because they're not complicit in the tyranny. But according to our founding fathers, and I think that's a scripture as well, you are complicit. If you know the good you ought to do and don't do it, you sin in the eyes of God and in the eyes of our founding fathers. It says, and maybe you could quote it better for me, maybe it was Martin Luther King Jr. who said it, but men who do nothing when they see evil going on are complicit. And why is everyone asleep? Why is everyone, you walk through any restaurant in any place in the country, I guarantee the following will happen. Do a little loop through the restaurant next time you're at a restaurant. 90% of the people will have their faces in cell phones instead of talking to the people sitting next to them. We are hypnotized, and it's literally making people crazy. They used to believe that praying mantises were cannibals. They mate, and then the female eats the smaller male because they put, like 100 10-gallon aquariums in a room and 100 couples praying mantises, and every single time the female ate the male. They said, well, that's just their behavior. Then, less than 5 years ago, a guy says, why don't we study them in the wild instead of in these confined spaces in a laboratory? He studies them in the wild, and they don't eat their partner after they mate. You see, that little insect is super smart. And by confining it, it became crazy. And people are becoming crazy by living in a virtual world most of the time. They don't realize it, and we're letting our children do it. I have a nephew, Uncle Bart, I'm so glad to see you. 1 minute later, he's sitting next to me on the couch with his face in a smartphone, watching videos on YouTube, which don't have much morality anyway. Those they leave up. Right.
That is the truth. There's no doubt about that. Well, go back to that part of your story, Bart, because you mentioned it, but I want to explore that a bit. You said it was really, you had kind of a coming to faith moment where you start reading your Bible, and that's what convinces you, look, I've only got one life here to live. I'm going to do something that matters, and I'm not going to stay silent and be complicit. Talk about that a little bit more.
Sure. I mean, I remember
you did not want to. This was not your path. You didn't want to go down this road initially, right?
Yeah, I was afraid. I've always liked puzzles and mazes in particular. In fact, I would get these maze books for adults, and they would rate a maze at, 45 minutes. I could do it in like 2 minutes. I don't know how, but I could. And then I started drawing mazes that adults found difficult. This is in the 4th grade. So I've always liked puzzles. And then if you see my follow-up film, Astronauts Gone Wild, that's the one where I get, punched and kicked. And we found an audio recording of an astronaut and his son literally talking about calling the CIA to have me killed, which wouldn't be necessary if the moon landings were real, you see.
Well, it's just like the censorship on YouTube. Whatever you can't talk about it, that's where the truth is. Because if I put out 100 videos that all said grass is purple, no one's going to care if I put that video out because it's not true. But if they censor you, that's right where the target is.
Yeah, generally, unless censoring you proves that you're correct, then they have to leave it up. But in any case, I like puzzles, and I have a relentless, never give up personality. In fact, if you believe God, right, and believe in God, and so I do, I have little imaginary conversations with me and God in my mind, going through the day. And one time I'm like, trying to overcome, I don't know what it was, smoking pot or drinking or something. I'm like, I keep, throwing it away and doing it again and drinking and throwing and, quitting and starting. And I'm like, God, why do you put up with me? And his, thoughts in my mind said, well, because you get off the horse and you always get back on. That's why. And so I know that about myself. I know I like puzzles. And when I was first asked back when I was like 26 years old to do a film about the moon landings being fake, I looked into it for about 6 months, shadows intersecting, the administrator of NASA resigning without explanation, and all these things didn't seem right. And I said, if I start looking into this and they did fake the moon landing, that could be dangerous, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, why should I risk my life for what Nixon did,
Mm-hmm.
in 1969? So I turned down the project. And then I had a client as a filmmaker who said they'd get one of my scripts to a famous producer if I did them a favor. I'm like, what favor? They said, read the Bible. So they gave me, or I went out and bought what's called a 1-year Bible. The Bible divided into 365 daily reads. And I remember I started reading, I think it was June 3rd, 1989, the day the man stood in front of the tanks in China, because that was the news story that day. And over the next 5 years, I had read the Bible 5 times from cover to cover. Now, I still wasn't a Christian. It would be like reading a book written by Beethoven on how to play the piano, and I read it 5 times and I'm still playing with 2 fingers,
Mm-hmm.
without an instructor. I don't really know how to apply what I'm reading. However, it did convince me there is a God. Things don't make themselves. And it makes sense that there's a judgment for how you live your life. That just seems logical. And then I realized if they faked the moon landing, that's more profound than if they had actually gone. And it's important. It's like a truth that mankind needs to know to advance, to the next level. And if we don't know it, then we won't advance. And so I said, this is important. This is worth dying for. I'm going to die anyway. So I might as well die for a just cause. So I changed my mind. And as serendipity or divine intervention would have it, a few days later, I meet a millionaire who builds rockets for NASA, who knows the moon missions are fake, who gives me $1 million to produce these 2 films about it.
Wow.
And I was doing it under the theory it might be true. And then 3.5 years into the 7-year project, I pop in a tape that says, do not show to the public on the screen. And one of the clips at Sibrel.com goes into a great explanation as to this quote window shot footage where they're creating a 1-foot model of the earth and pretending it's floating in space. The lights come up and you see it's a model. All the while we have a 3rd track of audio of the CIA telling them not to speak until a 4-second radio delay, is mimicked. And so when I saw that, I'm like, oh my gosh, they really didn't go to the moon. What have I gotten myself into? And I freaked out. I'm like, oh my gosh, I have proof in my house. The moon missions were fake.
Mhm.
What have I done? And that's when my phone calls were interrupted, that day. And I was followed from church that day on a Wednesday night. I was literally abducted by government agents in the back alley of CNN when I'm trying to get this tape in the back door, surrounded by government agents who illegally arrest me, take the tape, and drug me with true serum or something similar to it. And I escape their custody and I make my way back to Nashville. I pee in a cup and I say, I got him. I got this exotic drug in me to prove I was drugged by true serum or whatever it is. So I give it to a friend to put in a lab in his name, thinking I can outwit the CIA. And after a few days go by, we meet. And I said, well, what were the results? He says, well, there was a problem at the lab. And I'm like, well, what problem? He says, well, funny thing, they had a break-in over the weekend. And I said, well, so what? He says, well, funny thing, the only thing stolen was your urine sample, So all of this I go into in great detail, and I never have before. I never publicly talked about any of this because I know it's already difficult to swallow the fact that the moon missions really were falsified, not a theory, a fact. So I didn't want to go into the X-Files adventures, but I figured this is kind of my final statement on the matter. So this book, which is audio, I read myself, Kindle or print, is at Sibrel.com.
Love audiobooks.
Yeah, it's an audiobook or Kindle or print. I read it myself. And one of the chapters is called The Funny Thing Happened on the Way to CNN, which goes into great detail of my literal abduction by government agents, true serum interrogation, escape, and it's just this outrageous X-File encounter I had with government agents. And it's still going on because the book culminates with a deathbed confession from an eyewitness. This is not in the movie. It was only recently disclosed, and for the first time, my book is disclosing it. There was a gentleman by the name of Cyrus Eugene Akers, who was the chief of security at Cannon Air Force Base back in 1968. And in 2004, as he's dying, he's wanting, to get right with God. And he confesses in front of his son and military police that he is a murderer. He murdered somebody. And he murdered somebody at Cannon Air Force Base in Clovis, New Mexico, either in 1968 or 1969. And they said, why? Why did you kill him? He said, well, he and I both eyewitnessed the filming of Apollo 11, June 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1968. My friend thought it was morally wrong, and he was going to tell a reporter. And as the chief of security, I killed him so that that would not happen.
Wow.
He was given a list by President Johnson, who was there June 1st, 1968. And President Johnson said these 15 people are allowed in the visitor's door to observe and no one else. We published that list in the book. So around 2 years ago, which isn't that long ago, I had some good guy friends, and I talk about this in the book. I was literally rescued by good guys in the government. And as best as I could tell, they were Marine intelligence. And around 2 years ago or so, some good guy friends asked me to call two people on that list, that President Johnson's list, and let them know I had the list. This is before I published the book. And I got, afraid. I'm like, oh my gosh, are you wanting me to slit my own throat? Is that what you want me to do? They said, we got your back. We had your back before, we have it now, and do it. And I'm like, okay. I knew who one person was, Eugene Krantz, flight director, but I'd never heard of this other person. So I called them up and said, hey, your name is on the list. Project Slam Dunk, Cannon Air Force Base, faking the moon landing. What have you got to say for yourself?
This is one of the 15 guys that was allegedly there to witness the shoot, the video of this, right?
Not allegedly there. They were there.
Okay. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, because we have it in writing from President Johnson. But the point is, a few days after that, the son of the man who was the chief of security, who is now deceased, that's why I can mention his father's name now, his house was broken into. Everything about his father was confiscated that they could find. And then a few days after that, he was literally threatened with death, that they would kill him and his family if he ever spoke to me again about his father's participation in the faking of the moon landing at Cannon Air Force Base in 1968. Now, my dad was in the Air Force. I never heard of Cannon Air Force Base. I had to look it up. It's tiny, super tiny, which is perfect. Fewer eyewitnesses. And then I find out that, of course, every branch of the military has their intelligence division, special ops.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the headquarters of the special ops for the United States Air Force is at Cannon Air Force Base. And then I remembered my source at NASA, who first told me the moon missions were fake. And I literally had to go through my archives and pull out the interview of him, which I filmed, in which he said the whole thing was supervised by the United States Air Force. I'm like, oh. And then one of these people on the list, in his own memoirs, says he was at Cannon Air Force Base in 1968 for a, quote, classified reason, And so here we have four proofs, shadows intersecting, them using a 1 foot model, which NBC agrees proves they didn't go to the moon. We have the logic that you can't have 1,000 times better space traveling capability in 1969 than today. And then we have an eyewitness, like if I saw you, shoot somebody, that's pretty serious testimony for me to say so. And even more so as a deathbed testimony. So we have 4 times the necessary proof that absolutely proves they did fake the moon landing. They try to make fun of people who say so, but they did. And so, if they didn't kill anybody in faking it, I would still say, seeing how it's the most important event in human history that was contrived by a country that boasts about being so grand and honest and honorable, I would still say that's significant. But it really becomes significant when they start murdering people to cover it up. And these people are still in power, right? Until the truth about the moon landing fraud comes out, we will have criminals running our government. George Orwell said so. He said, whoever controls the past, right? They're saying about the past, the moon missions are real when they certainly were not, that whoever controls the past controls the future, which means until the truth about the moon landing fraud comes out, we will have criminals running the federal government of the United States, murdering their own people to cover up their crimes, according to Betty and Scott Grissom, who said so. And they
Bart,
have forensic evidence and testimonies to prove it.
do you believe it ever comes out fully? Obviously, you've pieced together the evidence. People like you and I can talk and realize that the puzzle pieces fit. But do you think this ever goes mainstream to where everybody acknowledges the moon landings were faked?
Logically, I would say no. Spiritually, I would have to say yes. Go to Sibrel.com and watch what is my best film probably I've ever made, best known film. A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, 45 minutes long.
Love it.
7 years to make. Just to edit the movie, I spent up to 4,000 hours, 40 hours a week for 2 years. And in the film, you will see that we open up with the scripture. Where there is pride, then comes disgrace. Or one translation says pride comes before a fall.
Mm-hmm.
And then we show the Tower of Babel, because up until about 200 years ago, the entire history of mankind's greatest technological achievement was the tallest building. Whoever has the tallest building is the most technologically advanced nation. And it says in Genesis 6 that the only reason they built the Tower of Babel was to boast, to say, look, we're greater than you. And interestingly, it was never finished. Then we show the largest machine ever built by the hand of man at that moment in history, 1912, the Titanic. And we show a publicity poster, which they said it was the ship that God himself could not sink. That also never finished, never made one voyage. And then we show Richard Nixon, who knew they were not on the moon. And he said, nevertheless, that faking putting a man on the moon was the greatest event since God made the universe. You see this constant thread of boasting. The rebuke of the Tower of Babel was known to everyone. The rebuke of the Titanic, the ship that God himself, was known to everyone. This one is not yet known officially. Maybe the delay is part of the spiritual lesson. Imagine there's a couple madly in love, they get married. 6 weeks later, one of them gets drunk at a convention and has a one-night stand. They could tell their spouse the following day, or imagine they tell their spouse on the 50th anniversary. I think it has more impact on the 50th anniversary, because you realize after all this time of all this, me boasting about your fidelity, you're now telling me you weren't faithful. Maybe that's the reason, the spiritual reason why it's delayed, so that the release will be greater. It would probably cause the stock market to crash and the dollar to crash, but so be it. We can't have gangrene on a limb and ignore it. We can't have mold and keep painting over it. We will die from the gangrene or the mold. You have to face facts. You have to have a house cleaning. So the last chapter of the book at Sibrel.com is called What to Do About This Mess. Suggestions that I make on how to rewrite the rules of a federal government in order to promote integrity. One of which is to have Congress and the Senate elected by lottery, which is how they choose a jury, which can decide life or death for someone. So I think if a lottery is good enough to decide life or death, then I think it's good enough to decide whether or not to put contains GMOs on a bottle of ketchup, which 90% of Americans wanted, and the president vetoed it. Now, is that a democracy or not? It's not. And if both parties are corrupt, just ask Ron Paul and Bernie Sanders. If an outsider can rise to the top, then there is no hope unless there's a tear down of the current system and one is rebuilt. And maybe the moon landing fraud coming out will help facilitate that. When people realize the extent of the lie, the arrogance, the homicide of our own federal government, killing their own people to cover up their crimes. And they're still doing it to this day, because until these, criminals are caught, they're just going to keep perpetrating crimes, and even to a greater degree. So it's highly significant that the moon missions were fake, when the government that was founded on the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is now completely the opposite. They're murdering their own people. They're taking away life. They're saying that you don't have the right to open your business without permission, or to go to church without permission, or to go shopping without permission, which means one group of people is the masters and the other group of people are the slaves. I mean, how come we don't see that? That's cut and dry, right? If one group of people decides what another group of people gets to see on the internet, then one group are masters and one group are slaves. You see? And what's the best way to have slaves? Is to trick them into thinking they're free. We're in the land of the free, the land of the free. Well, I went to NASA with press credentials, with an appointment. And I asked an Apollo astronaut whether the moon landings are real or not, and I was thrown out by security. I was asked by a student body of the University of Pittsburgh to show my film and to lecture on the moon landing fraud, and the university forbid it in a country of alleged freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. You see, there is not. We are slaves. If the government has the right to turn off your electricity and drag you off to jail because you have 5 people over the 4-person limit at your child's birthday party, then one group are masters and the other group are slaves. I don't care if 9 out of 10 people are dropping dead. The 10% still need to buy toilet paper and tuna fish. So it's your right as a free person to go shopping under those circumstances, and it's your right as a business owner to open your store under those circumstances. So they're a threat to life. They're killing their own people, according to the Apollo astronauts' relatives. They're a threat to liberty. You have to get permission, like a slave, to do everything. And if it's your happiness to go to church or open your business, then they're not allowing that either. So they're doing things so much worse than King George ever did. The founding fathers had so much more freedom under British rule than we have now. It's ridiculous. And people are just lulled to sleep like a frog in a lukewarm, water that's gradually going to a boil, and they're just gotten used to tyranny like it's the way it's supposed to be. And it's not.
Well, you're not going to get any argument from anybody, I don't think, watching this video, because we completely agree. Bart, your story is so interesting to me because, all of us who come to this point where you start looking into it and you start realizing the dots are not connecting, of the official story, we all, none of us started doubting the moon landings. And we were all raised about how great is NASA and how great are all these space missions. And I love that that's your story too, with the NASA posters up on your wall. You grow up thinking this is wonderful, and you've been told that in school, and you've seen the videos and you've seen the news clips, and then eventually we all get here. So, sometimes people think, oh, you just got your tinfoil hat on, or you're a conspiracy theorist. No, we were all in the same boat as the rest of you. We just started looking into it, and then it's almost impossible to look into it and not start to see these things. And I just love how you've put it all together. I know we only have a few minutes left, but I'd like to just hit it. You went through so much so fast. If I can just do a couple rapid fire with you as we wrap up here. The big things to me, I know the lighting is one of the first things that you noticed, the shadows, the lighting. We didn't even talk about other people look at, well, the flag is waving, it's not waving, are there stars or no stars? All of that type of stuff, camera angles. It's interesting, but to me, it's one of the first things you said tonight. It's never happened before in the history of recorded civilization where 50 years later, we've gone backwards in technology. I mean, to me, it's almost open and shut right there. The fact that we allegedly landed on the moon in 1969, we went 1,000 times farther than we can go right now, 50 years ago, with a millionth of the computing power, and we nailed it on the first try. I mean, I don't know how gullible you have to be to believe all of those things, and then we just 50 years later have decided never to go back. How is that not common sense, Bart, to just piece that together? Forget about shadows and lighting and everything else.
Destroying all of the hardware, all of the blueprints, all of the schematics of the equipment. That's never been done in the history of the world either, right?
I got to play this. Thank you for reminding me. I've got this queued up. Everyone's got, this is Don Pettit with NASA. This is a real clip, real guy. Listen to what he says. Well, Don, someone asked him, Don, why can't we go back? You went there in 1969. Why haven't we gone back again? Listen to what he says.
Technology.
I'd go to the moon in a nanosecond. The problem is we don't have the technology to do that anymore. We used to, but we destroyed that technology, and it's a painful process to build it back again.
Yeah, so we have two things that have never happened in the history of the world before. Never before has technology been greater in the past and in the future. That is, if the moon landings are real, that would be the first time. And then the second thing that has never happened in the history of the world, it's the same event. That technology that was developed at the cost in today's dollars of $200 billion was intentionally destroyed. Now, like I said, you might consider doing that with the atomic bomb, but they didn't do that, did they? 10 years
Not even
later,
then.
10 years
No.
later.
No.
10 years
no.
later, not 50 years later, 10 years later, exponential increase of technology, atomic bombs were 1,000 times more potent, you see? So the fact, just imagine Bill Gates building the first computer, and it costs $200 billion. It works fantastic. And when he's done, he takes all the hardware, all the blueprints, all the schematics, and throws them in a furnace.
It makes no sense.
Of course.
No.
Why would they do that? And so they would never do that. The B-52 is 70 years old, and there's still 200 of them flying today in the Air Force because nothing works better. You wouldn't destroy a technology unless you're covering up a fraud. So the fact that they destroyed everything is actually proof of the fraud, because if you really went, you would never destroy it. But if you were perpetrating a fraud, that's exactly what you would do. So the fact that they destroyed everything is actually proof of the fraud, because the idea that you could, have the lunar module power air conditioning against 250 degrees outside down to 72 nonstop on a bunch of car batteries just technically can't be done. Neither could you land a rocket vertically, as they claim to do 6 times in a row flawlessly on the moon. 50 years later, Elon Musk had 600 million times more computing power than the lunar module. 600 million times more computing power. And the first time he tried to land a rocket vertically, it blew up. The second time he tried, it blew up. The third time he tried, it blew up. The fourth time he tried, it blew up. The fifth time. Okay, so how is it they landed a rocket vertically the first and 6 times in a row with 1/600 millionth the computing power?
And are they doing that remotely too from control station back on Earth? I can't even get Wi-Fi to work in my house half the time. They're controlling the landing module from on the moon from the Earth. Come on. In 1969.
Well, yeah. It couldn't fly itself. Elon Musk had computers flying it, and it still took 6 times. For example, the space shuttle is so aerodynamically sensitive. A pilot cannot land it manually. It cannot be done. They'll be the first to tell you this. It has 5 redundant computers, so that if the first computer goes out, there's a backup. If the second, third, and fourth computer go out, there's still the 5th one, because it cannot land without a computer. It cannot be landed manually. There's no pilot skillful enough. It takes a computer to do it because it's so sensitive aerodynamically. The same thing with the lunar module. If Elon Musk, with computers, 600 million times more computing power, can't do it the first 4 attempts, there's no way they could do it by hand. You know what I mean? And it's just a joke.
To me, you could just almost stop right there. That is, I don't know how you can't piece that together to understand that's open.
Well, that's why they destroyed all the blueprints, because you could later prove that it didn't have the right capacity, that it couldn't stop a micrometeorite, that it couldn't power air conditioning down to 72 degrees for 3 days on, a bunch of car batteries. There's many reasons that prove it.
I believe, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the Van Allen radiation belts were not discovered or not known at the time they did these original flights in 1969. And then they were later discovered, and NASA was asked about it. And they said, well, how'd you get through those? And they said, well, that's not a problem. We didn't know about them back then.
Maybe one person said that. They actually misspoke, because in Astronauts Gone Wild, one of the Apollo astronauts says we never went through the radiation, which of course he'd have to go to the moon and back. But NASA knew about them, and that's one of the many reasons they couldn't go. We also found publications by von Braun that said to go to the moon in one rocket, it would have to weigh 800,000 tons worth of fuel. The Saturn V only had 2,500 compared to 800,000 tons, a difference of 30,000%. And then Elon Musk just said about 6 months ago, in order to go to the moon, you'd have to make 9 fuel trips first into orbit. And that's what von Braun said.
Wow.
You can't go straight to the moon. You have to build a space station and ferry up fuel, and then from there go to the moon. So this is why they destroyed all the equipment, to make sure no one could prove mathematically, electronically, it couldn't leave Earth orbit. It didn't have enough fuel, didn't have battery enough power, didn't have computing power. That's why they destroyed all the technology, because you could prove it, electronically, that it couldn't be done. Therefore, they got rid of the record.
Well, I think even though they've destroyed it, we're proving it logically. I mean, it's just
Oh, yeah.
it's not pass muster at this point. We don't
You
have
just
time
have to be, you just have to have an open mind.
Yes.
Why is it that the college professor says even if an astronaut confessing the moon missions are fake, he would still think he walked on the moon anyway?
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like him
Yes.
as a 10-year-old watching it on TV in his living room knows better than the man who was there.
Yeah.
There's something wrong with people's brains if they can't accept facts. And pride is simply the unwillingness to be wrong. And humility is the willingness to be wrong. And it's good to be wrong. You're not walking around in error, and you're learning something new. And I get a lot of emails from people who said, when they discovered 9/11 was a fraud, that opened their mind to the moon landing fraud. And it was, for me, the other way around. Me knowing about the moon landing fraud opened my mind to the 9/11 fraud.
I think you are unique. I do find most people I talk to go the other way. I was the other way too. I was 9/11 first, and then you find yourself pretty quickly back on the moon landing.
Yeah, and then it's so easy to fake. There's no independent press coverage, right?
Mm.
How do we know where they are? You have to trust all the pictures, telemetry, radio transmissions are from the federal government. It's so easy to fake, and then you have people wanting to believe it. I'm sure they got away with it easier than they thought. But just to make sure, Richard Nixon does not show up for the launch. All the world leaders from around the world are there at Cape Canaveral, but not the president of the country who's doing it. He was afraid to have his picture taken with Neil Armstrong that day, and maybe the fraud would come out. After they got away with faking it, then he shows up for the next launch. Can you believe it?
I did not know that.
That wouldn't happen if the moon missions were real either.
I did not know that. Wow. Bart, a couple other really quick rapid fire questions for you, and I know you got to go, but do you you might not have any opinion on it, but any opinion on India claiming to send a lunar module to the moon recently?
Well, I don't think it matters. You can.
It looked very fake, by the way.
Yeah, well, you can. You can X-ray a toaster 1,000 times; it'll still make a piece of toast. X-ray a human 1,000 times, you're going to have a problem. This is one of the reasons they can't go to the moon, and why mannequins are orbiting the moon instead, because of lethal radiation. It doesn't really matter whether it's real or not. It could be real. Probes can go to the moon, technically, theoretically. India is probably in on it. I mean, just ask world leaders what happens when you don't cooperate with the United States, right? Ask Gaddafi, ask Hussein, ask Noriega what happens when they turn on their master. They are taken down. I know somebody who works in the Chinese Space Agency in headquarters, Command Central. And he told me everybody there knows that the moon missions are fake. And get this, the Chinese government is blackmailing the United States government, forcing them to forfeit technology, space technology, that NASA is secretly and illegally giving the Chinese government in exchange for China not publicly announcing the moon missions are fake.
Yeah, that does not surprise me.
So that's another good reason for the truth to come out.
It is a very good reason. You said something there. I want to get your opinion on this. Do you believe that unmanned modules or anything unmanned probes, anything like that, have been sent to the moon, or do you believe nothing has made it there?
No, I think probes have been there. I suspect the U.S. eventually sent a probe there. The Chinese probes appear to be genuine because the soil is brown and not caramel. And in most of the Apollo pictures, of course, when I start saying this, they're going to go back and correct them. But the rocks in the Apollo pictures are just sitting there on top of the surface like they were put there. In the Chinese pictures, they're half buried under micrometeorite dust, which collects over the years. So another reason why I think they're genuine. Again, you can, X-ray a piece of equipment and it'll still operate. But the problem is the radiation and then the fuel, which would be 1,000 times greater to support human life and water and food and shielding of organic, humans in order to survive. And then, according to von Braun, once you landed on the moon, you'd have to immediately go into a cave or a shelter
Mhm.
because of micrometeorites. The Earth, is, as best as I can tell, is hit by like 10,000 meteors a day. Most of them burn up. So these are little particles of sand, 10,000 a day, hitting the moon's surface or more, particles of sand traveling at 25,000 miles an hour, which would go through the spacecraft, your spacesuit, your skull, and kill you immediately. He
Mm.
said there was a 50% chance every 24 hours of a catastrophic failure from a micrometeorite, which means if you're there 2 days or more, there's a 100% guarantee you'll be hit by a micrometeorite. Well, then how did they bounce around on the moon's surface for 3 days and never get hit by one? You see, so that's another problem. There's so many problems to being able to walk around on the moon that it just can't be done with current technology. Otherwise, we'd be there. I mean, the South Pole has minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 100-mile-per-hour winds, and there are bases there because it can be done. So if you could go to the moon, there would be bases there. There's no bases there simply because it can't be done. And think about this, just to go to the South Pole on Earth took like 5 tries. So NASA has never kept a schedule in their entire history, not a single time. Even putting a telescope into Earth orbit with 20 years better technology than Apollo was 10 years behind schedule. The only time NASA has ever kept a schedule was the most complicated mission of all time. They were ahead of schedule. They said in 2014 they're going to have people orbiting the moon in 2018. Never happened, right? 4 years behind schedule. They have mannequins orbiting, right? And not people. So that's never happened in the history of NASA, keeping a
Well,
schedule, except the moon landing one, right?
right. The reason I asked, and I'm just a curiosity for me more than anything, but the reason I ask about manned versus unmanned, do you believe anything unmanned has made it there? I've heard some of your other interviews, and you are not. You don't go. Usually, people in terms of red pills go 9/11, then they go moon landing, and then some go to flat Earth. You are not taking that. You've taken a different approach. You went moon landing, 9/11, and then you don't go to flat Earth, from what I understand. That's not your deal. But I guess my question is, you come from a Bible background. You said your faith got you into this. First, book of the Bible, Genesis, talks about a firmament. Are you are not of the belief there's something firm up there that does not allow you to go in any capacity to the moon? You're not in that realm of thinking with a firmament.
No, I mean, the Bible wasn't written in English. The real word is not firmament. And additionally, Solomon in Song of Songs says, your eyes are rubies, your lips are diamonds. So I guess she had lips of diamonds and eyes of rubies. No, it's a metaphor. When people poetically talk about the sun going up or down or left or right or whatever, it's from their point of view. The whole flat earth, I believe, is a psyop to discredit people. The word wicked means the blending of truth and lies together, from a candle wick, which actually has 2 strands instead of 1. So people are so jaded with the government lying. If the government said the sky was blue, people are going to say it's green because the government always lies. No, they lie half the time, and you have to know which is which. The fact is, if you exhale a bubble underwater or do a soap bubble, in the atmosphere, it forms a sphere because of barometric pressure is equal around it. Gravity is really a curve in space. So that's why all objects in space are spheres. It's just part of God's design. Now, maybe God designed it that we cannot leave Earth because of the Van Allen radiation belt. And maybe even at the point where we were able to set foot on another heavenly body, maybe that's the perimeter God set to begin Judgment Day. I don't know. But even with a spherical Earth, it looks like it's God's will for us to be stuck here. And if you go to Sibrel.com, you can read an article I spent hundreds of hours writing and researching called Are There Really Aliens from Outer Space? And if von Braun, the guy who faked the moon landing, told his best friend before he died that the government is planning a fake alien invasion, then what this really means is that there is no life elsewhere in the universe, only here. You see, the government wants us to believe the exact opposite, that life is plentiful. Well, this article that I wrote at Sibrel.com, it has multiple links in it, including a radio telescope scientist saying, look, we've been pointing radio telescopes in all directions of the universe for 50 years, not one radio signal. We're it. And if you read Revelation 21:3, It says, when God makes the new heaven and the new earth, that he will dwell with us personally. Now, the Bible says on at least 5 occasions, I believe, that God does not show partiality. So if there's life in other worlds and he dwells with us and not them, then he's showing partiality. The only way he could dwell with us and not show partiality is if we're it. And I believe that's the case. Now we may populate the rest of the universe in the afterlife. I don't know. We might get bored. You know what I mean? I don't know. But it looks like we're it. And actual scientists are beginning to conclude that we are it. I mean, intelligent life would have radio signals. And there's not one radio signal anywhere in the universe except from Earth. I think we're it. And if you delve into it.
So I'm sorry to interrupt you. So you believe it's unknown right now if we truly could get off this planet or not. We might be able to in the future.
Theoretically, you could. I mean, if you wanted to invest, $1 trillion or $2 trillion, you could build a space station. Then you could build a spacecraft that has like 3 feet of lead or a bunch of water surrounding it to protect you from radiation.
Mm-hmm.
And then you could have robots first build a lead shelter on the moon. And then you could dock with that and very quickly go from the spacecraft into the shelter on the moon if you wanted to. But seeing how, about 50,000 people die a day of starvation, 30,000 of those are children, I think it's not actually intelligent to spend resources to do that. I say give everybody indoor plumbing and concrete floors first. And then if we have money left over, notice that Bill Gates doesn't go into communities and give them indoor plumbing and concrete floors. Instead, he gives them birth control. So instead of helping the poor people, he wants to get rid of the poor people, you see? And so another side point, while we're talking about God, the show Ancient Aliens, I thought was a one-time documentary. And then, years later, I find out it's a series of, dozens and dozens of episodes. Well, if aliens are really fallen angels, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it says, I think in Ezekiel, that Lucifer wanted to be God.
Mm-hmm.
And these people who are producing this show, Ancient Aliens, I can't say they're named after a Greek god of deception. They conclude that mankind was made intentionally. They have to, because there was a study done about 15 years ago called the Eve Project. They took DNA samples from every nationality on Earth, from Eskimos, Africans, Swedes, South Americans, and so forth. And with new DNA technology, they were able to trace the family tree backwards in time. And they concluded 100% you can show the graph, the math, the DNA math. Every person on planet Earth came from one woman, just like the Bible says. So the show can't deny that. That's a scientific fact. And there was no one before her. You see that? There wasn't evolution. The human race just appeared.
Mm-hmm.
So they can't deny that, but they want to say there's no God, in my opinion, so there's no morality and they do what they want. So they came up with this theory to fit that box. No God, but mankind just suddenly appeared as if created. How can we make that work? Okay, I got it. We were made by aliens, right? Now, they don't answer the question that I, as a third grader, would ask, in episode 1. Well, okay, if we were made by aliens, then who made them?
Yeah, that's right.
Right? And get this, Noah. Okay, so if aliens are really fallen angels in disguise, I mean, they lie. They say we're from a civilization 300 light years away. How can you prove it or disprove it, right? And they're liars, the father of lies. So if they're saying we were made by aliens, which are really fallen angels, which are led by Lucifer, what they're actually saying, Noah, is we were made by Lucifer instead of God. That's actually what they're saying. Isn't that interesting? Satan wants to take the credit for creating mankind, which they admit was created. They say mankind was created. Boom, we were put here. But instead of by God, they say by aliens, which are Luciferian, which is what they're really saying. And then if you go to World Economic Forum, CERN, Google, all the people around the world. I mean, just look up the logo, World Economic Forum. It
Oh, yeah.
has three O's and a half circle going through the O's, which forms 666.
Yes.
They literally worship Lucifer.
Mhm.
And how ironic, the father of lies, Apollo means Lucifer, that the Luciferian moon landing is a lie. I mean, it just when it dawns on you that this is true. Let me conclude with this, Noah. I remember 20, however many years ago, what was it? Truman Show came out.
Oh, yes.
I was a young hotshot filmmaker, Nashville, Tennessee. I worked like 2 or 3 days a week, and so I saw the film on a Tuesday or something at noon. I think I'm the only person in the theater. And after about 20 minutes, I walk out. I say, "This is dumb. This is the dumbest film, implausible, stupid plot I've ever seen." Now, I watch the film at least once a year and cry every time I see it. But at the time, I was like arrogantly, a snob filmmaker saying, "This is dumb. This is implausible." Well,
It's hidden in plain sight. They put it right out there.
Well, the point is, imagine, you come to me, Noah. You're a screenwriter. I'm a film producer, and you give me the script. I look at it, and in the script, the greatest country on earth, the one that all the immigrants want to immigrate to, they kill their own elected officials. They fake beginning of wars to slaughter their own people. They fake the moon landing, the greatest accomplishment of all time, and they murder people to cover it up. I would say, next, that's not plausible.
Right.
That's too hard to believe. And when I confront people that the moon missions were fake, their number one reason is it's too hard to believe. The government wouldn't lie about such an important thing.
Right.
And the craziest thing about the moon landing fraud is that it's absolutely true, not a theory. Just go to Sibrel.com, watch the films on the homepage, get the book. There's 16 clips, and you're going to have the epiphany that I did halfway through making the movie, that, oh my gosh, they really did fake the moon landing.
Bart,
yeah.
Before we wrap up, I got to press you on this one more time, just out of my own curiosity. And you're the guest, and people are here to listen to you and not to me. So with all total due respect, and of course, because I don't know either, but everything you have told me tonight fits perfectly with us being under a firmament that keeps us from leaving this planet. With so much investigation that you've done and so many things that you have found out are lies, and with the Bible saying the word firmament, I'm just curious, and I don't know, it could mean nothing, but why no openness to the possibility that we're basically under a snow?
I am open to it. I had a flat earth friend. I said, send me all your flat earth stuff. I studied it. And there's a video, I wish I could, quote it, but basically there was a guy 2,500 years ago, puts a stick in the ground, measures the shadow angle, goes to a city, he calculates however many miles away, puts a stick in the ground, measures the distance and calculates the circumference of the earth. And 2,000 years later, he was off by 300 miles, or a pretty relatively small amount. And then I live near the coast, and I see these huge cumulus clouds over the ocean horizon very regularly, and they're half out of view because they're below the curved horizon. Nevertheless, even though I think it's a psyop to discredit people, let me add this, and I think it's the first time I'm saying it because it's only dawning on me as I'm listening to you, Noah. You're still conceptually right. I just realized that. If the Van Allen radiation belt prevents us from leaving, and if there is no life, no intelligent life anywhere in the universe, which I believe is true, then it's really the same thing.
Is it the same thing? Right.
It really is the same thing. We can't leave. We can't even go to the moon. And we're it. We are it. Hebrews 12:1, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. I think I got goosebumps. You're conceptually correct. My point is this, I have looked into it. I just disagree. I'm willing to be wrong. Show me. But I see half the clouds going beneath the horizon, which means the earth is curved. And so, but still,
can you bring those clouds back with the P1000?
I don't know. The point is, it's irrelevant. The earth could be a triangle. It doesn't matter. The issue is the corruption in the governments of the world. That's the issue.
True.
Jesus never said you had to pass a geography exam to enter eternal life. The issue is not the shape of the earth. The issue is the corruption in the world, right? Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, rather expose them. And so it's relevant for people to know that their leaders faked the moon landing and murdered people to cover it up. It's important. And the weird thing is that 75% of the public knows Oswald did not kill Kennedy. 50% know that explosives brought down the buildings in 9/11, and yet nothing is done about it. You have William Benny going on national TV, worked for the NSA for 30 years. He says, oh, by the way, we spy on the private cell phone conversations of Supreme Court justices so we can get sexual and financial dirt on them to blackmail them to vote the way we tell them to vote. So no one contradicts him. No one says that's not true. So it's established, even in the mainstream media, that Supreme Court justices are being blackmailed and not a single investigation. So the last chapter of my book at Sibrel.com is what to do about this mess. Choose Congress and the Senate by lottery, have them nominate 5 candidates for president, which the public will vote on, and then no longer allow presidential appointments of all the government agencies, because many people in the FDA, EPA, Justice Department say we want to bring corruption to light, and they're told if they do, they're fired. So you have corrupt presidents because both parties are corrupt, appointing corrupt leaders of every department, and that's why there's no investigation by the Justice Department or the FBI of Supreme Court justices being blackmailed. The FBI should nominate, vote, appoint their leader from within. So should the EPA, Justice Department. They know the rank and file who's honest and not. Presidential appointments should no longer be allowed because that's a big part of the problem. So we need a rewriting, you could say, of the Constitution, the rules, things to that nature. We need our government to advise us, not to dictate to us. Like either if someone says I'm going to arrest you, if you have 5 people at your son's birthday party and not 4, either the arresting group are the parent and the other group are children, or one are masters and one are slaves. Either way, the federal government is not to be our master. They're not to be our parent. They're to advise us. I did a statistical analysis. Even if the numbers were true about alleged fatalities from the thing that's been going on for the last 3 years, you're statistically more likely to die in a car crash on the way to church than you are to die from a communicable disease picked up at church. So I guess we better make cars illegal, right? For everyone's safety. Better start living close to church and walking to church. They say, the World Health Organization says that by the end of the century, which is how many years is that? Less than 70 years, 1 billion people are going to die from smoking cigarettes. All they have to do is write a 1-sentence law. Cigarettes are now illegal, manufacture or sale. End of story, every country. But they're not. So they're not really interested in our health, are they? Otherwise, they'd make cigarettes illegal, right? And make cars illegal, right? Because more people are dying in car crashes on the way to church than getting diseases at church. So it's not about that. It's a scam. It's an excuse for us to become more and more accustomed to tyranny. And so one last thing, I have a weekly podcast. If you go to Sibrel.com, it's called Bart Sibrel's Box Escape, where I talk about how sometimes even the alternative media can be led astray because they're on the CIA's radar. So sometimes we're given a morsel like a UFO leak, or a military source says this about aliens, and that's a lie as well. And then a second podcast called the End Times Church, where we talk about the end times, and world events from a biblical point of view. Just go to the podcast button there at Sibrel.com.
Our guest today has been Bart Sibrel. Bart, absolutely fascinating. A real pleasure and joy getting to chat with you. I've been wanting to do this for several years, and it finally came together. So it's been great having you here. We're going to put the link to your website down below. Everyone can see it on the screen. Sibrel.com, Sibrel. I've watched your videos. Recommend everybody watch those videos and everybody grab the book because it is fascinating and obviously more than we can cover in an hour. So we just barely scratched the surface. So there's a lot more out there. So Bart.
Yeah, let me add, it's on my heart to add, Noah. My wife and I, we don't agree on the theology of the Bible about things like the feast days, So what? You and I agree on 99%. Maybe we disagree about one, geography. So what? Right? That's what I want to remind people of. Okay. It doesn't matter. My wife, you and I probably agree more than my wife and I do. So, you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
No one can agree about everything. That's the unique thing. I have a feeling when we make it, God willing, to the other side, there's going to be a lot of laughter. We're gonna each. Here's my fantasy. every single person who ever lived, seeing how we have eternity, is going to be the star of the show. The rest of the world is going to go to their banquet, and we're going to watch a video of their life, their mother giving birth to them, when they, dropped their ice cream cone and cried. And there's going to be a lot of tears, but a lot more laughter. Either you're going to be laughing that the earth is sphere, or I'm going to be laughing that it's flat. But you know what I mean? Like I said,
and
God
Bart
to pass a geography exam to enter heaven.
No, that's right. And I just ask questions. I truly don't know. I mean, none of us know for sure. And just as I dug into the moon landings and see things don't make sense, I see other things here that I ask questions about, but I don't know. I'm skeptical of both, actually. So you're right. We're all going to find out at some point, and it's not central to faith. Although I do believe if it turns out that we are under a snow globe, whether the earth is flat or whether it's a sphere, there could be a snow globe around it, right? Like you say, geography.
Yeah, I think
doesn't
the
matter.
most important thing that you and I both agree, you see, in your flat earth and in my globe earth, it's really the same thing.
Yes.
We're alone in the universe, and we're God's creation. I mean, if it were mathematically proven, scientifically proven, like you said, what if it were proven that the moon landings were fake to the world? What would that mean? If it proves that we're all alone and that Eve just suddenly appeared in the DNA, it means there's a God. And that's just what it means, whether we understand God or not, right? And so I think the result is really the same.
I think so too.
We're in the universe, and we're being watched by the spiritual realm, and we're in a spiritual warfare. And the moon landing fraud is just kind of like the poster child of the struggle between lies and truth. And I lay it out as best I can at Sibrel.com, and book and video. And when it dawns on you, it's sad but true, and it's better to know the truth. I end each chapter with a quote, and I think the first chapter ends with the quote: "The bitterest truth is better than the sweetest lie."
Very good. That is very true. We'd rather know the truth, even if it's hard to swallow. Well, Bart,
Yep.
Thank you so much for coming on. It's fun to get to ask questions and maybe even have a little debate. So this has been a lot of fun. Love to have you back on soon. And maybe next time we'll talk more about this fake alien invasion and Genesis 6:4 and all that stuff too. It sounds like you're very knowledgeable in those areas. So had a lot of fun, and we'll hope to have you back on again soon.
Yeah, if you want to read that article about aliens, what they really are, just go to Sibrel.com.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll find Bart. I'll find that link, and I'll put that specific page right below too, so people can find.
Yeah, or just put Sibrel.com, and then people can find everything there.
You got it. We'll send them over. Really appreciate you coming on, Bart. You are absolutely fascinating to chat with.
Likewise, Noah. I look forward to part 2.
All right. Thank you. Have a good one.